Aloha Internet, my name is Ulrik and I'm a PhD student at the Department of Computer Science at the University of Oxford. I'm pleased to do this virtual presentation of our paper on design interventions for self-control on Facebook. So Facebook provides many obvious benefits, such as staying in touch with friends or coordinating groups and real-life events. But a large amount of research has focused on possible downsides to using the site. So for example, many studies have linked particular ways of using Facebook to outcomes such as lower academic achievement or negative psychological states such as low self-esteem, anxiety, or loneliness. When it comes to the behavior involved, two findings are often highlighted. First, negative outcomes are associated with passively consuming content created by others rather than actively using the platform to communicate with friends. And second, we're spending large amounts of time on the platform. In addition, negative outcomes are associated with feeling unable to control one's use of the site. A shortcoming of the existing research, however, is that most work has been correlational studies where people at a single time point have been asked to, for example, self-report how they use Facebook and how they're feeling. And so, a recent review called instead for experimental studies that change how people use Facebook to help clarify issues of directionality. What might such studies look like? Well, it turns out that there is a wide range of digital self-control tools available on online stores. So these are apps and browser extensions that help people exercise self-control over the use of digital devices, for example by removing or blocking distractions. And many of these are targeted directly at Facebook. For example, the Newsfeed Eradicator is a browser extension that removes the newsfeed and replaces it with motivational quotes. It has more than 100,000 users on the Chrome Web Store. Another example is To-Do Book, which replaces the newsfeed with a to-do list to remind you of your goals when you're on the site. Yet others make the site less engaging, for example by removing numerical metrics or by turning it black and white. These tools provide some clues about how changing specific design elements might support people in changing their Facebook use if they find it problematic. And they present a ready opportunity for us to do experimental studies. But we don't have any existing research on the effects of interventions delivered by these browser extensions, so we decided to do an exploratory study to investigate how they might affect behavior and subjective perceptions of use on laptop. So we began with a pre-study to select interventions to investigate. We manually searched the Chrome Web Store and identified 50 extensions for supporting self-control on Facebook. Then we selected two interventions based on common functionality and popularity, and also by mapping functionality to a dual systems model of self-regulation. This model helped us think about the interventions in terms of whether they focused on quick automatic responses during Facebook use, what people sometimes call System 1, or whether they focused on conscious goal-oriented control, often referred to as System 2. You can read the details about this in the paper. Most of the extensions that we reviewed removed distracting elements from Facebook. More than half of them specifically removes the newsfeed and optionally replaces it with other content. So for the first intervention in our study, we chose to simply remove the newsfeed. To compare this to another type of strategy, we chose an intervention from an extension called Focus Book. When opening Facebook, this intervention prompts you to type in what you need to do on the site. Every few minutes, it then pops up a reminder of what you typed. The blue banner at the top here will expand until you type in what you need to do, or if it's a reminder, until you click a snooze button. We chose this intervention because Focus Book had the largest number of users among extensions that didn't just remove distracting elements, and because from a dual systems perspective, it was a complementary approach to removing the newsfeed. You can read details again in the paper. As control condition, we turned the background white, which we didn't expect to have any significant influence on behavior or perceived control. Our study asked the following questions of these interventions. First, how do they impact time spent and number of visits? Second, how do they impact patterns of use, particularly on this passive versus active dimension? And third, how do they impact people's feeling of being in control over their use? These research questions follow directly from the findings of the existing literature that I mentioned in the beginning. In addition, we were interested in whether the effects in these areas would persist when we removed the interventions again, And we were also interested in how the interventions might inspire our participants to reflect on what future interventions might look like. So what did we do? Well, we recruited 58 students at the University of Oxford to a study on Facebook distraction. Then we randomly assigned them to receive one of the 3 interventions. And in the beginning of the study, we met individually with all of them and had them install 2 extensions on their laptop. One for anonymously logging how they used Facebook, and another for the intervention of their condition. We told them to use the Chrome browser when accessing Facebook on the laptop, and also that the extension may change how Facebook appears at some point during the study period. The participants also filled in an opening survey with demographics and basic information about how they accessed and used Facebook. The study lasted for 6 weeks. In the first 2 weeks, we measured baseline use. In the second 2 weeks, we applied the interventions, and in the final 2 weeks, we removed them again to have a post-intervention baseline. We triangulated data from 3 different sources. So we collected objective behavior on Facebook using the open source Rose extension, which would make timestamps when people, for example, brought a tab with Facebook in or out of focus, or if they liked content and so on. Then by the end of each 2-week block, we had participants self-report on the use of Facebook in an online survey, which included the commonly used scales passive and active Facebook use measure, as well as the multidimensional Facebook intensity scale. After the 6 weeks, then we did semi-structured interviews with all participants about their experience, probing whether the interventions worked as we expected them to work, how they experienced the intervention, and also what changes, if any, they might want to make to Facebook to support themselves in using it the way that they wanted. Primarily because of issues with the intervention not working properly on some Windows laptops, our final dataset included logging data from 46 participants, survey data from 49 participants, and interview data from 57. You can find the details about these exclusions in the paper. We did the quantitative analysis in R using RStudio, and for the qualitative analysis, 2 of us transcribed the interviews and then performed inductive thematic analysis following an open coding approach using the software Deduce. So what did we find? Well, the control condition didn't have any effect on time or visits to Facebook, but the experimental interventions had distinct effects. So in the logged use, we observed that goal reminders decreased the average number of daily visits. In contrast, removing the newsfeed decreased the average length of a visit, but not the number of visits. When it comes to what people did on Facebook, the amount of scrolling we logged decreased significantly in both experimental conditions, on average by 42% in the goal reminder condition and by 73% in the no newsfeed condition. This was supported by people's self-report on what they did in the passive and active Facebook use measure, where 2 items varied significantly with condition: browsing the newsfeed passively and browsing the newsfeed actively. So, in both experimental conditions, participants said that they did less passive browsing of the newsfeed. Whereas, unsurprisingly, in the no newsfeed condition, people also reported less active browsing, as they should because they didn't have a newsfeed. So in other words, the goal reminders selectively reduced passive but not active newsfeed browsing. In terms of feeling in control, it was a common theme in the qualitative data in both experimental conditions that the interventions helped people stay on their intended task during use, but they did so in different ways. So goal reminders were said to help you snap out of automatic use, whereas the remove the newsfeed instead stopped unintended use from being triggered in the first place. But both interventions had their downsides. So the goal reminders were often annoying or frustrating, which largely seemed to be because they weren't sensitive to context. For example, P32 said that it was extremely annoying because I need to tell someone something and then this thing comes up. But P40, on the other hand, said that if I was scrolling through the newsfeed or checking events, then it wouldn't be annoying because I shouldn't do that on my laptop while I'm working anyway. The downside to removing the newsfeed, again somewhat unsurprisingly, was fear of missing out if people relied a lot on the newsfeed to get information. However, it was a theme in the qualitative data that because most participants also had a smartphone, then they could use cross-device access to work around the downsides of the interventions while still enjoying their benefits. However, P40 from before went on to say that if she was using Facebook for something like sending messages about work, contacting friends, or asking for help, and the gold reminder became too annoying, well then she could use her phone instead. In terms of removing the newsfeed, P28 said that it enabled her to reap the benefits of the newsfeed, but without being sucked into it on two platforms. Finally, in terms of effects when the interventions were removed again, the participants in the gold reminder condition continued to make fewer visits in the second baseline compared to the first baseline. One of the qualitative themes underpinning this was that the gold reminders created a habit of asking oneself about the intention of use. So P1 said, "It's not a reflex anymore now that I've had that experience where I have to write everything down." For the no newsfeed condition, self-reported passive browsing of the newsfeed remained lower in the second compared to the first baseline. One of the themes for the interviews supporting this was feeling less attracted by the newsfeed when it returned. Finally, in terms of reflection on future interventions, I want briefly to highlight that our participants expressed a need for more granular levels of control than what Facebook makes available. So, a theme expressed by more than half of participants was that the newsfeed didn't give them what they wanted, and they wanted easier control over the amount and type of information that they were being shown. A related theme was being able to remove or modify elements driving you to use a site in a different way than you'd like, from viral videos to even suggesting that content could be text only during work hours. And a third theme related to this was having flexible blocking options that could meet people's personal definitions of distraction. And so blocking or limiting Facebook altogether, as opposed to just blocking particular subsets, wasn't seen as a good match with how the site was actually being used, for example, for some work purposes. So what? What do we learn from this? Well, we believe this exploratory study shows a clear potential of doing mixed methods experiments on Facebook using browser extensions that are inspired by the existing digital self-control tools. This should be of particular interest to researchers studying problematic Facebook use, because it allows us to do studies that are more informative than, for example, studying effects of blocking or deactivating Facebook altogether, as some people have been doing in recent years. For researchers interested in digital well-being more generally, we also think it demonstrates how Facebook can be used as a testbed for a range of design interventions, because the platform combines so much functionality and because it has a rich existing literature on how and why people use it and what they tend to struggle with. Zooming out, the wider context includes Mark Zuckerberg's announcement in 2018 that Facebook would focus on being not just fun, but also good for people's well-being and for society. Later that year, Facebook announced new tools to manage your time on Facebook and Instagram. The public discussion on this continued last year when the US Senate held a hearing on persuasive technology on internet platforms, and the UK House of Commons called for a duty of care on social media companies. We think the work we've presented here is important to inform discussion in this space and to prompt thinking about specific design aspects. So, for example, the time visualizations and limiting tools that Facebook have introduced in their mobile apps seems somewhat disconnected from the specific controls over experience that our participants suggested, as well as from the self-control tools for Facebook that are popular on the Chrome Web Store. Our study also has some important limitations. So first, we measured Facebook use on laptop only. We did triangulate data from logging, surveys, and interviews that suggested that the changes we saw in logged behavior on laptop also translated into subjective usefulness. But future studies should extend our methods to include tracking of cross-device use. Second, our study was an exploratory study with a sample size that was small enough to allow us to interview all participants. And so follow-up confirmatory studies are needed to evaluate how robust our findings are. Third, our sampling was restricted to university students, and so follow-up work is also necessary to see if our findings will generalize to other populations. So to sum up, we found that goal reminders and removing the newsfeed had large and distinct effects on behavior. We found that they both helped reduce unintended use through distinct routes, and also that they had distinct downsides. And finally, I've highlighted that this exploratory work should be followed by confirmatory studies. You can find our materials, our data, our analysis scripts, and the R Markdown source file for our paper on the Open Science Framework. Thank you so much for your attention.